Ishmael, the forgotten son. According to Genesis 16:3, Abraham's first child with the Egyptian Hagar was Ishmael. God will hear, God hears, God heard, and may God hear are some of the meanings of this name Ishmael. His birth. Many years before this, God promised Abram that he would have many descendants. Genesis chapter 12, verse 2. God said, "And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you abundantly, and make your name great, exalted, distinguished. And you shall be a blessing, a source of great good to others." Genesis chapter 12, verse 2. To this point, he had no children through his wife Sarai. Sarai proposes a child for Abram through Hagar. Genesis chapter 16, verses 1 through 2. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had not borne him any children, and she had an Egyptian maid whose name was Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, "See here, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. I am asking you to go in to the bed of my maid, so that she may bear you a child. Perhaps I will obtain children by her." And Abram listened to Sarai and did as she said. Hagar was almost certainly part of what Abram received during his time in Egypt. Abraham had spent a while in Africa. Therefore, Pharaoh treated Abram well for her sake. He acquired sheep, oxen, male and female donkeys, male and female servants, and camels. Genesis chapter 12, verse 16. Sarai had the understanding that God was in charge. He had promised Abram and Sarai that they would have descendants, but after many years, those descendants had not yet appeared. Sarah endured a great deal of suffering, including the following: the anguish of having her hopes dashed, which made her heart sick, the anguish of her prayers being unanswered, the anguish of her arms having never before cradled her own child, the anguish of the public's disgrace. Abram was persuaded by Sarai to take part in what was effectively a surrogate mother arrangement at the time. The infant would be regarded as Abram and Sarai's offspring, and not as the offspring of Abram and Hagar, in accordance with the custom. Sarai might defend her actions by arguing that they were necessary to carry out God's promise. It's possible that she thought to herself, "Abram, God made a promise that you would be the father of many nations, but he didn't specifically mention me. Perhaps you are the father of many nations, but I can confidently say that I am not their mother." Nevertheless, for a variety of reasons, this was not in accordance with the will of God. It was a sin against God's plan for marriage, which is that one man and one woman come together in a one-flesh relationship. It was a sin against Abram and Sarai's marriage, as the surrogacy wasn't done in a doctor's office but in a bedroom. It would have been appropriate for Abram to say something to the effect of, "Sarai, bless your heart, but you are my wife, and we're in this together. Let us believe God all over again for a miracle. I don't want to sin against God in our marriage with this Egyptian servant girl." Abram agrees with Sarai's suggestion. After Abram had lived in the land of Canaan 10 years, Abram's wife Sarai took Hagar the Egyptian maid and gave her to her husband Abram to be his secondary wife. He went into the bed of Hagar, and she conceived. And when she realized that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress, regarding Sarai as insignificant because of her infertility. Genesis chapter 16, verses 3 through 4. Both Sarai and Abram exhibited behaviors consistent with unbelief. Although Abram did not formally marry Hagar, the way he treated her was consistent with the way a man ought to treat only his wife. It had been more than 10 years since the promise was made regarding Abram's descendants. By most accounts, 10 years seems like a long time to wait for the promise of God. Abram undoubtedly behaved in accordance with his own strength and knowledge when he agreed to lay with Hagar rather than trust in God's capacity to produce an heir through Sarai. Then Hagar conceived. When viewed from Sarai's point of view, the fact that Abram was successful in making Hagar pregnant was a dreadful event. In her own eyes, this demonstrated beyond any shadow of a doubt that Sarai, and not Abram, was to blame for their inability to produce a son for Abram. Because having children was so highly regarded in Hagar's culture, the fact that Abram, a wealthy and important man, chose Hagar to be the mother of his child gave Hagar a higher position than Sarai and made it seem as though she was more blessed than Sarai. Whatever a man or woman tries to accomplish apart from God will be a wretched failure, or maybe a more miserable success, depending on how you look at it. Almost immediately, Hagar started regarding herself as superior to Sarai and a better person overall. A bad situation became worse. Then Sarai said to Abram, "May the responsibility for the wrong done to me by the arrogant behavior of Hagar be upon you. I gave my maid into your arms, and when she realized that she had conceived, I was despised and looked on with disrespect. May the Lord judge who has done right between you and me." But Abram said to Sarai, "Look, your maid is entirely in your hands and subject to your authority. Do as you please with her." So Sarai treated her harshly and humiliated her, and Hagar fled from her. Genesis chapter 16, verses 5 through 6. We read, Sarai said, "My wrong be upon you." Sarai laid the blame for all that had happened to Abram, and she had excellent reason to do so. He should have acted as the spiritual leader and told his wife that God was able to perform what he promised, and they didn't need to try to perform God's promise by disobeying him and relying on man's strength and wisdom. We read, "I became despised in her eyes." Hagar's contempt for Sarai started the problem. She couldn't resist displaying an inappropriate haughtiness, thinking her pregnancy somehow showed her to be better than Sarai. It appeared as though Abram was making a bad situation even worse when he gave Sarai responsibility for the problem and did not look after the child he was the father to. Yet in this, he also put his relationship with Sarai first, and that was good. Because of our disobedience, we frequently find ourselves in family circumstances that are painfully complicated and challenging. When everything is taken into account, it is much simpler to live one's life in a way that is trusting in and submissive to the Lord. God desires to keep us from having to deal with these complexities and challenges. Sarai's cruelty collided with Hagar's pride, and all Hagar could think to do was to run. Even with nowhere to go, she fled from her presence, probably headed back to Egypt, her original home. But the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, on the road to Egypt by way of Shur, and he said, "Hagar, Sarai's maid, where did you come from and where are you going?" And she said, "I am running away from my mistress Sarai." The angel of the Lord said to her, "Go back to your mistress and submit humbly to her authority." Genesis chapter 16, verses 7 through 9. Hagar flees from Abram and Sarai. Hagar's attempt to flee eventually brought her to a spring. It's possible that she was too scared to continue farther and risk losing this water source. During her time of need, she was visited by the angel of the Lord. It would appear that the angel of the Lord was a tangible presence because he communicated with Hagar in the same manner that a person would communicate with another person. We don't have the sense that this was a mere spiritual impression or a voice in the wind. There was a person physically present with Hagar, and that person was the angel of the Lord. In coming years, that very same angel of the Lord would visit Abraham, Moses, Balaam, Israel, Gideon, Samson's parents, David, and Elijah. This is the very first time that the angel of the Lord is mentioned in the Holy Scriptures. He didn't first appear to Noah or Enoch or Abram. The angel of the Lord first appeared to a single mother-to-be who had a pride problem and was mistreated by the woman who put her into the whole mess. All of this causes us to be amazed at God's love for the unlikely, and we should never forget that He often delights in doing this. We read, "Where have you come from, and where are you going?" The angel of the Lord posed a question that was both significant and illuminating. In Hagar's pride and misery, she acted without thinking. "Where have I come from? Where am I going?" We read, "Return to your mistress and submit yourself under her hand." The angel of the Lord told her to repent. If she changed her course, there was an implicit promise waiting for her. "Obey me, and I will protect you." The promise of the angel of the Lord to Hagar. Then the angel of the Lord said to her, "I will greatly multiply your descendants so that they will be too many to count." The angel of the Lord continued, "Behold, you are with child, and you will bear a son, and you shall name him Ishmael." God hears, because the Lord has heard and paid attention to your persecution, suffering. He, Ishmael, will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against every man, continually fighting, and every man's hand against him, and he will dwell in defiance of all his brothers. Genesis chapter 16, verses 10 through 12. Not only was it promised to Ishmael that he would have a large number of descendants, but he was also the first person in the Bible to have his name given to him before he was even born. This was a very significant promise. God had a plan for this boy and his descendants. If God doesn't have a purpose for something, then he won't name it. We read, "You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has heard your affliction." The name Ishmael means God will hear. The life of Hagar's son would not be easy, but God would still look over him and sustain him. God's blessing and protection of Hagar and Ishmael. Then she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her. "You are God who sees." For she said, "Have I not even here, in the wilderness, remained alive after seeing him, who sees me with understanding and compassion?" Therefore, the well was called Bir Lahai Roi, well of the living one who sees me. It is between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar gave birth to Abram's son, and Abram named his son, to whom Hagar gave birth, Ishmael, God hears. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar gave birth to Ishmael. Genesis chapter 16, verses 13 through 16. Hagar was aware that the one who appeared to her was more than a simple angel. The angel of the Lord was also the God who sees, the same one watching over Hagar and the yet-to-be born Ishmael. She realized that if God was able to be with her in the desert, then he would also be with her when she had to submit to Sarai's authority. It is as if Hagar addressed God in this manner: "You have looked upon me, and now I can look upon you." It would appear that Hagar did return with a heart that was willing to submit. Abram named the infant Ishmael. She told the whole story to Abram and Sarai. God appeared to Abram again at 99 years old. Abram was 75 years old when he left Haran. When Hagar gave birth to their son Ishmael, he was 86 years old at the time. He had been waiting for the promise that God would provide a son to him through Sarai for around 25 years at that point. God said, "I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings will come from you. I will establish my covenant between me and you and your descendants after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your descendants after you. I will give to you and to your descendants after you the land in which you are a stranger, moving from place to place, all the land of Canaan as an everlasting possession of property, and I will be their God." Then God said to Abraham, "As for Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, my princess, but her name will be called Sarah, princess. I will bless her, and indeed I will also give you a son by her. Yes, I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of peoples will come from her." Genesis chapter 17, verses 15 through 16. We read, "And I will bless her and also give you a son by her." God made it abundantly clear by emphasizing the word her that another circumstance involving a surrogate mother, like the one involving Hagar and Ishmael, would not result in the birth of this baby. Sarah herself would give birth, even though it was past her time in life to do so. Sarah was about 90 years old at this time. Abraham's response to the promise. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed, and said in his heart, "Shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? And shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child?" And Abraham said to God, "Oh, that Ishmael, my firstborn, might live before you." Genesis chapter 17, verses 17 through 18. Abraham fell on his face and laughed. Abraham and Sarah were both well aware that they were long past the age at which most people had children. However, Abraham had faith, and this is mentioned in Romans chapter 4, verses 17 through 21. Paul painted a beautiful picture of Abraham's confidence in God's promise. "I have made you a father of many nations, in the sight of him in whom he believed, that is, God who gives life to the dead and calls into being that which does not exist. In hope against hope, Abraham believed that he would become a father of many nations, as he had been promised by God. So, numberless shall your descendants be. Without becoming weak in faith, he considered his own body, now as good as dead, for producing children, since he was about 100 years old, and he considered the deadness of Sarah's womb. But he did not doubt or waver in unbelief concerning the promise of God, but he grew strong and empowered by faith, giving glory to God, being fully convinced that God had the power to do what he had promised. Romans chapter 4, verses 17 through 21. At the same time, Abraham did not truly have a comprehensive understanding of the promise that God had made. It's possible that he assumed God intended that Ishmael would merely be Sarah's spiritual son. It was difficult for Abraham, like it is for all of us, to trust God for things that were beyond the scope of what he could imagine. God repeats the promise and names the child who will come forth from Abraham and Sarah. But God said, "No, Sarah, your wife shall bear you a son indeed, and you shall name him Isaac." Laughter. "And I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his descendants after him. As for Ishmael, I have heard and listened to you. Behold, I will bless him, and will make him fruitful, and will greatly multiply him through his descendants. He will be the father of 12 princes, chieftains, sheiks, and I will make him a great nation. But my covenant, my promise, my solemn pledge, I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you at this time next year." And God finished speaking with him and went up from Abraham. Genesis chapter 17, verses 19 through 22. The child will be given the name Isaac, which means laughter, not only because he would bring his parents so much happiness, but also so that Abraham would always be reminded of the fact that he had laughed at God's promise to give him a son through Sarah at such a late age. God then says, "As for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I have blessed him." Ishmael will be blessed. God would answer Abraham's prayer for blessing on Ishmael, making him fruitful and to multiply him exceedingly. However, the covenant and all of its promises would only be fulfilled via the son who was yet to come, the boy of promise. Genesis chapter 17, verses 23 through 27. Then Abraham took Ishmael his son, and all the servants who were born in his house, and all who were purchased with his money, every male among the men of Abraham's household, and circumcised the flesh of their foreskin the very same day, as God had said to him. So Abraham was 99 years old when he was circumcised, and Ishmael his son was 13 years old when he was circumcised. On the very same day, Abraham was circumcised, as well as Ishmael his son. All the men, servants of his household, both those born in the house and those purchased with money from a foreigner, were circumcised along with him, as the sign of God's covenant with Abraham. The promise of Isaac is later confirmed in Genesis 18, when Abraham met 3 strange men that turned out to be divine. The birth of Abraham's son. God fulfills his promise to Abraham and Sarah. Genesis chapter 21, verse 1. The Lord graciously remembered and visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for her as he had promised. This promise did not come true immediately. It took 25 years, but God remained true to his word throughout the entire process. The promises of God are unbreakable. It was not because Abraham was flawless in his obedience that the promise of a son was fulfilled. Rather, it was because God was trustworthy in keeping his word. Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore to him, Isaac. Isaac became a wonderful type or picture of the Messiah to come, Jesus Christ. Both were specially promised sons. Both conceptions were miraculous. The conflict. The child Isaac grew and was weaned, and Abraham held a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. Now, as time went on, Sarah saw Ishmael, the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, mocking Isaac. Therefore she said to Abraham, "Drive out this maid and her son, for the son of this maid shall not be an heir with my son Isaac." The situation distressed Abraham greatly because of his son Ishmael. Genesis chapter 21, verses 8 through 11. Despite the fact that there was around 13 years of age difference between the two kids, this dispute between them was nearly unavoidable. Abraham found it hard to agree with Sarah's complaint when he did not want to reject his son through Hagar, Ishmael. In Galatians chapter 4, verses 22 through 29, the Apostle Paul used this conflict as an illustration of the conflict between those born of the promise and those born of the flesh. Galatians chapter 4, verses 22 through 29. For it is written that Abraham had 2 sons, one by the slave woman, Hagar, and one by the free woman, Sarah. And the child of the slave woman was born according to the flesh and had an ordinary birth, while the son of the free woman was born in fulfillment of the promise. Now these facts are about to be used, by me, as an allegory. That is, I will illustrate by using them. For these women can represent 2 covenants. One covenant originated from Mount Sinai, where the law was given, that bears children, destined for slavery. She is Hagar. Now Hagar represents Mount Sinai in Arabia, and she corresponds to the present Jerusalem, for she is in slavery with her children. But the Jerusalem above, that is, the way of faith represented by Sarah, is free. She is our mother, for it is written in the Scriptures, "Rejoice, O barren woman who has not given birth. Break forth into a joyful shout, you who are not in labor. For the desolate woman has many more children than she who has a husband. And we, believing brothers and sisters, like Isaac are children, not merely of physical descent like Ishmael, but are children born of promise, born miraculously. But as at that time the child, of ordinary birth, born according to the flesh persecuted the son, was born according to the promise and working of the Spirit, so it is now also." Under God's instruction, Abraham sends Hagar and Ishmael away from his household. God said to Abraham, "Do not let it distress you because of Ishmael and your maid. Whatever Sarah tells you, listen to her and do what she asks, for your descendants will be named through Isaac. And I will also make a nation of Ishmael, the son of the maid, because he is your descendant." So Abraham got up early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar, putting them on her shoulder, and gave her the boy and sent her away. And she left, but lost her way, and wandered aimlessly in the wilderness of Beersheba. Genesis chapter 21, verses 12 through 14. Although Sarah offered him counsel, Abraham could have easily rejected it. However, he decided to seek the Lord's guidance in the matter. He ultimately followed Sarah's suggestion and did so without feeling like he was simply giving in to her demands. We read, "Then she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba." It may have seemed ruthless of Abraham, but it is a mystery of God. It seemed that God had plans. God preserves Ishmael and Hagar in the desert. Genesis chapter 21, verses 15 through 18. When the water in the skin was all gone, Hagar abandoned the boy under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him, about a bow shout away. For she said, "Do not let me see the boy die." And as she sat down opposite him, she raised her voice and wept. God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy from where he is resting. Get up, help the boy up, and hold him by the hand, for I will make him a great nation." The resources that Hagar and Ishmael had finally ran out as they continued their journey away from Abraham. They had used up all of their water, so Hagar placed Ishmael in the shade of one of the plants and left, resigned to the fact that they would soon perish in the desert. We read, God heard the voice of the boy. As Hagar lifted her voice and wept, God answered. Curiously, God answered in response to the voice of the lad instead of specifically to Hagar's weeping. Ishmael pleaded for mercy and assistance in some fashion or another. In spite of the extremely difficult situation they were in, God's promise gave Hagar and Ishmael reason to fear not. Ishmael was a direct descendant of Abraham, and because of this, God treated him with great favor. Even though Ishmael was not the son who was chosen to receive the promise of the covenant, God did not hold it against him. The people who descended from Ishmael developed into a powerful nation. Genesis chapter 21, verses 19 through 21. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water, and she went and filled the empty skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with Ishmael, and he grew and developed, and he lived in the wilderness and became an expert archer. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. God provided for Hagar and Ishmael in one way or another, whether it was through the creation of a new water supply or through the revelation of an already existing water source. We read, So God was with the lad, The idea is emphasized that God was not against Ishmael and his descendants. God was with Ishmael and had a promise for his future. Ishmael did help his half-brother Isaac bury Abraham after Abraham passed away, despite the fact that Abraham had given everything to his son Isaac. Upon Abraham's death, he left everything to Isaac, but Ishmael did help his half-brother bury Abraham. Now Abraham gave everything that he had to Isaac, but to the sons of his concubines, Hagar and Keturah, Abraham gave gifts while he was still living, and he sent them to the east country, away from Isaac his son of promise. Genesis chapter 25, verses 5 through 6. Abraham gave his wealth to Isaac, and he gave the promise of the land God had promised to him to Isaac. Abraham's death and burial. Genesis chapter 25, verses 7 through 11. The days of Abraham's life were 175 years. Then Abraham breathed his last, and he died at a good old age, an old age who was satisfied with life. And he was gathered to his people, who had preceded him in death. So his sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah, in the field of Ephron, the son of Zohar, the Hittite, which is east of Mamre, the field where Abraham purchased from the sons of Heth. There Abraham was buried with Sarah his wife. Now after the death of Abraham, God blessed his son Isaac, and Isaac lived at Beer Lahai Roi. Abraham, who is considered to be one of the most significant figures in the Bible, has left this world. He is mentioned 70 times in the New Testament alone. Only Moses is mentioned more frequently than he was, 80 times, in the New Testament. Abraham had a remarkable long life, having lived for a total of 175 years. His life wasn't perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but he was a man of faith who had a genuine relationship with God, who displayed incredible obedience, and who was a genuine friend of God. James chapter 2, verse 23. And the scripture was fulfilled, which says, Abraham believed God, and this faith was credited to him by God as righteousness and as conformity to his will, and he was called the friend of God. After the death of Abraham, that God blessed his son Isaac. Abraham, a great man, was still human. God's work continued through generations. Now God carries on his covenant through Isaac. Ishmael's descendants. Genesis chapter 25, verses 12 through 18, lists the descendants of Ishmael. They are indeed numerous, divided into 12 tribes, and as God had earlier revealed. Now these are the records of the descendants of Ishmael. Abraham's son, whom Hagar the Egyptian Sarah's maid bore to Abraham. And these are the names of the 12 sons of Ishmael, named in the order of their births: Nebaioth, the firstborn of Ishmael, and Kedar, Abdeel, Mibsam, Mishma, Duma, Massa, Hadad, Timah, Jetor, Naphish, and Kedemah. These are the sons of Ishmael, and these are their names by their settlements and by their encampments, sheepfolds, 12 princes, sheiks, according to their tribes. Ishmael lived 137 years. Then he breathed his last and died, and was gathered to his people, who had preceded him in death. Ishmael's sons, descendants, settled from Havilah to Shur, which is east of Egypt as one goes towards Assyria. He settled opposite east of all his relatives. Genesis chapter 25, verses 12 through 18. Here the 12 sons of Ishmael are named. Ishmael was a blessed man since he had a large number of sons who would continue the family name. However, he was not blessed with the inheritance of the covenant God made to Abraham. We read of 12 princes. In addition, we found mention of 137 years. Ishmael was a man who was truly blessed, as is evident from all of these accounts. Despite the fact that he was not a recipient of the Abrahamic covenant, the blessing and hand of God were upon him. Ishmael lived a total of 137 years. We read of Ishmaelites in the story of Joseph, where Joseph's brothers sold him to a trader. Genesis chapter 37, verse 36. Now the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and captain of the guard. It is highly probable that Hagar was one of the slaves given to Abraham by Pharaoh when he expelled him and Sarah. If Abraham had chosen to live a separate life and not adopted the ways and customs of those around him, he would have avoided the sin and sorrow that arose from his relationship with Hagar.